It's all sorted, or so the government tells us. Don't worry about Brexit and all the legislative changes it entails. Ministers say the law protects LGBT people from prejudice and will quickly snuff out any future attempt to harm people on the basis of their sexual orientation or gender identity. After all, we have the Equality Act 2010 which, to all intents and purposes, puts the prohibition on discrimination against LGBT people on the same footing as gender or race. There's also the Human Rights Act 1998 and the related case law that shows how UK courts and the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg can protect LGBT people. With all this protection available, surely it doesn't matter if the government gets rid of the EU's human rights framework post-Brexit. Well, as things stand we'll have to hope so, because that's David Davis's plan. When we leave the EU, we'll retain all EU law except the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. A key point in the negotiations remains Britain's access to, on withdrawal from, the EU customs union. Since the referendum there has been hot debate over the meaning of Brexit. Would it entail a full withdrawal from the existing agreement, known as hard Brexit, or the soft version in which we would remain part of the common customs area for most goods, as Turkey does? Number 10 has so far insisted that Brexit means Brexit and that Britain will be leaving the customs union, but may be inclined to change its position once the potential risks to the UK's economic outlook become clearer. Though progress was made last year, there has still been no solid agreement on whether there should be a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. To ensure borderless travel on the island, the countries must be in regulatory alignment and therefore adhere to the same rules as the customs union. In December, the Conservative Party's coalition partners, the DUP, refused a draft agreement that would place the UK/EU border in the Irish Sea due to its potential to undermine the union. May has promised that would not be the case and has suggested that a specific solution would need to be found. Despite protests from a small number of Conservative MPs, the government and the EU are largely in agreement that a transitional period is needed after Brexit. The talks, however, have reached an impasse. Though May has agreed that the UK will continue to contribute to the EU budget until 2021, the PM wants to be able to select which laws made during this time the UK will have to adhere to. Chief Negotiator Michel Barnier, seen here with EU Minister David Davis, has said the UK must adopt all of the laws passed during the transition, without any input from British ministers or MEPs. The Prime Minister has promised EU citizens already living in the UK the right to live and work here after Brexit, but the rights of those who arrive after Brexit Day remains unclear. May insists that those who arrive during the transition period should not be allowed to stay, whereas the EU believe the cut-off point should be later. Despite this being a key issue in negotiations, the government has yet to lay out exactly what it wants from a trade deal with the EU. Infighting within the cabinet has prevented a solid position from being reached, with some MPs content that no deal is better than a bad deal while others rally behind single market access. The EU has already confirmed that access to the single market would be impossible without the UK remaining in the customs union. The government has already begun trying to woo foreign leaders into prospective trade agreements, with various high-profile state visits to China, India and Canada for May, and the now infamous invitation to US President Donald Trump to visit London. However, the UK cannot make trade agreements with another country while it is still a member of the EU, and the potential loss of trade with the world's major powers is a source of anxiety for the PM. The EU has said the UK cannot secure trade deals during the transition period. Banks in the UK will be hit hard regardless of the Brexit outcome. The EU has refused to give British banks passporting rights to trade within the EU, dashing hopes of a special city deal. However, according to new reports, Germany has suggested allowing trade on the condition that the UK continues paying into the EU budget even after the transition period. Yet the reality is that in the absence of an express, open-ended prohibition on sexual orientation discrimination, such as that contained in the EU Charter, gay, lesbian and bisexual people will remain at risk from harm. And while the government tell us we have nothing to worry about, it's not a great many years since being LGBT meant experiencing institutional prejudice on a daily basis. The memories are very clear and very real for many. David Davis mocked after attacking EU Charter he previously praised. It's true that the European Convention on Human Rights, which is the basis of our Human Rights Act, and other human rights treaties ratified by the UK have been interpreted to mitigate discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. The specific words don't appear, however. The Charter is different. It contains an explicit prohibition on discriminating against someone because of their sexuality. That means whenever EU law is in play, the Charter applies, and if you are gay, lesbian or bi, you cannot be discriminated against. For anyone who remains in any doubt about why the government's proposal to ditch the Charter matters, recent court cases throw the issue into sharp relief. Last Monday, the US Supreme Court held that the issue to be resolved in a case where a baker had refused to bake a cake for a gay wedding was the way in which the baker was treated by the local state-run Human Rights Commission, as opposed to addressing the underlying discrimination. This was possible because, in the absence of sexual orientation protection at the federal level, the US Supreme Court was able to twist the case and make it about something which it wasn't. Gay, female or both in America, your rights now come with an asterisk. Contrast this with the judgment of the European Court of Justice handed down the following day. That court, the EU's highest, decided that the term spouse, for the purposes of EU free movement rights, must include a married same-sex partner. In this case, where the judgment was underpinned by the EU Charter, the prohibition on LGBT discrimination necessarily formed the backdrop. This fundamental principle is therefore a tenet of EU law because of the Charter. And then last Wednesday came the decision from the Bermuda High Court reinstating equal marriage there. That court found that the legislature couldn't simply remove same-sex marriage and replace it with something different, and by implication lesser, domestic partnerships. This was because Bermuda's constitutional framework expressly forbids discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. Therefore, marriage could not be denied a gay or lesbian couple. Theresa May urges divided Tory MPs to back her in key Brexit votes. As it happens, the UK Supreme Court is also considering a gay cake case at the moment. Arguments have already been heard, and it seems inevitable that the baker will lose because the law at the moment requires that people are protected on the basis of their sexual orientation. The root of that protection is, yes, the EU Charter. Nowadays we take LGBT equality more or less for granted, but the truth is that if the Charter is lost, or, indeed, deliberately jettisoned by our present government, the chances of our courts following the path of the US Supreme Court and downplaying discrimination on grounds of sexual orientation will inevitably increase. The Equality Act is, after all, just an act of Parliament. Its scheme can be easily altered. New laws could be passed enabling bed and breakfast owners to discriminate against gay men and lesbians. Catholic adoption agencies might just lobby hard enough to persuade a future government that they shouldn't be required to allow LGBT people to adopt. The old, easily forgotten ideas about gay rights not amounting to equality might become fashionable once again. And then where will we be? On Wednesday the House of Commons will consider the amendments of the House of Lords in relation to the EU Withdrawal Bill and the Charter specifically. The House of Lords opposed the government and voted to retain it. If the Commons overturns the Lords' amendment and the Charter is rejected, LGBT people in the UK will be less protected and therefore more vulnerable. The Charter is a vital bulwark against the dilution of LGBT rights and should be regarded as such. What do we want Britain to look like after Brexit? Was the decision to leave the EU a vote against human rights? Was it a vote against the LGBT community? If the Charter goes, it will feel like it, and before too long we may start to live out the grim consequences.